Thanks very much, Daniel. And just to make sure I don't screw up, I have it here. Rob Winthrop is an environmental anthropologist, and maybe he will explain to you what that is sometime during the course of this evening, now based in Washington, D.C. He's worked as a consultant, a federal social scientist, and an academic, focusing on energy and resource extraction, climate change, indigenous rights, and social impact assessment. He's had articles published in Nature Climate Change, Wiley Interdisciplinary Reviews, Climate Change, Ecological Economics, and Ecosystem Services, among other journals. Rob and his wife, Kate, moved to the Rogue Valley in 1981 and still have a home in Ashland, and they come back to Ashland every summer, and that's why we're lucky enough to have Rob here with us this evening. He's currently a research professor in the Department of Anthropology, University of Maryland, College Park, and is planning to go back there within a few weeks, and that's why we scheduled him for tonight. And the talk that you're about to hear is one that he has given in other places, I think, basically, and probably as he's starting, he will explain to you where else he's been doing this kind of presentation. So I'll pass the... what do we call this? The microphone?
The talking stick.
The talking stick to Rob.
We'll let you use a lapel.
Okay.
Unless you really want the talking stick.
No, that's
Okay,
fine.
now apparently you can't talk unless you have the walking stick. Talking stick.
Okay.
Perfect. Can we get a round of applause for our presenter?
Oh, yes. Alan, thank you very much for that introduction, and I want to thank all of you for coming, and particularly the active leadership of SOCAN for giving me this opportunity to speak to you tonight on, oh, that was the wrong thing to do, on a deliberately provocative title, How Climate Science Divides Us. How could that be? After all, we all support climate science. I certainly do. I think you do too. In fact, there's a little bait and switch, because that's the title of, there are 3 parts to this talk, and that's the title of the second part, as I'll explain in a minute. I was talking with, I'm hearing some echo. Am I getting, yeah. Thank you, Jill. So I was speaking to my neighbor Louise just now as we were having our moment of conversation and discussing conversations about climate change, and I mentioned kind of depressing conversation I had with my 13-year-old grandson a few months ago, I think after Trump was elected, and I asked, what do we, what do people think at your school? And I think the context was climate change, because he's very engaged in that. He said, we're all going to die. And as Louise said, and I've said, and you've all said, we can't give in to that. We cannot accept the notion that this onward rush of disaster is inevitable. So part of what I'm trying to say this evening is that while at a national and certainly international level, there is enormous dysfunction, while at the local and regional level, and SOCAN is, Rogue Climate and other organizations are living proof of how vital action is going on at a local level. But while we are facing institutional dysfunction, we don't have to accept it. And there are some things that those of us who support climate action, I speak collectively, I think that we have fallen into doing that have magnified the problems. It's bad enough that we have a denial machine, as you know, well funded by oil, gas, and other interests that has been going full tilt for decades, but that's not the only problem, and that's part of what I want to get to this evening. What is an environmental anthropologist? Well, an anthropologist is one version of social scientist who tries to understand human practices and human beliefs in a social context with a given heritage, with a given ongoing set of understandings. And that could be what it is to be a Parsi, or it could be what it is to be a certain type of computer programmer in Silicon Valley. These intersect, they're not just separate little oranges. An environmental anthropologist is someone who specifically tries to integrate that investigation of social life and understandings with interactions with the natural world. And climate change is Climate change is a perfect example. It is not, as I'm going to argue, a problem, a technical problem merely for the natural sciences. It is an interdisciplinary problem, and the subtitle, Social Dimensions of Climate Change Mitigation, kind of says that. Okay, moving forward. So, well, I'll say a couple things. I'm going to get to my conclusions in about 30 seconds here, because it's helpful when you embark on a journey to have some understanding of where you're trying to go. And with a talk, we call those conclusions. And if I tell you up front where I'm trying to go, then you will be better able to judge whether anything I'm claiming is in fact supported by what I'm going to tell you, or whether it just is all just kind of wandering in space. But before I get to that, regarding a bit of the bio, as Alan said, I was, among other things, I worked for the Interior Department, which is now, as a civil servant for 15 years, heading the Applied Social Science Program at the Bureau of Land Management nationally in Washington, D.C. Today, that type of job is called a rogue bureaucrat, so we need to learn the new language. It's no longer civil servant. I was a rogue bureaucrat along with many hundreds of thousands of other rogue bureaucrats. But both in that job, where I worked with my colleagues to try to understand the human impacts of declaring an area for wilderness or opening up another oil field or whatever you want, was obviously fraught with controversy, with people with different interests and different values struggling. And for 20 years before that, when we were based full-time here in the Rogue Valley, I worked primarily with Indian tribes in the Northwest and California over conflicts over natural resource development and tribal values, rights, etc. I say this because really the point of my talk can be condensed to a lesson that I've learned over and over again from those professional experiences, which is that if you have any hope for collaboration, you don't need agreement. You do not need the parties to see the world the same way. I mean, obviously that's nice, but that often it's hard to come by. What you need on the one hand is a reasonable level of trust, and you need to have more or less common goals. So that if you focus on the action, getting toward the goals, rather than parsing the question of what's your worldview? Do you believe in climate change? I don't believe in climate change, and et cetera. And then we get into a whole generally pointless harangue. If we focus on the goals, then we may find more allies than we realized we had. Bless you. Moving on to what my elder daughter in her snarky teenage years used to interrupt my dinner table lectures by going like this, by which she meant, Dad, what's the point? Which is really irritating. But at least in later life, I have learned to try to, at some point, indicate what the point is. So I think I have 5 points. 1, climate change is as much a social as a technical problem. 2, we need to look to the social as well as the natural sciences for solutions. We need to encourage social mobilization around shared goals rather than shared beliefs. We need to shape strategies for mitigation around social values and practices, things that are important to people. And finally, we should pursue climate action as, where possible, as a co-benefit of other socially desired goals. It may not always be politically feasible to go right at the target and to say the point of doing this is to fix climate change. But if you say we really need to clean up the air in this city, you will be at the same time reducing greenhouse gas emissions. Okay. So, three themes here. The first, how the climate establishment, by which, let's say for shorthand, I mean the UN international process and the various things that hang on to that, and their national subparts, how that has failed us. I don't think I need to spend a lot of time on that, but I'm going to go through some of it quickly just to kind of make a few points that I think are relevant. Then how climate science divides us, and finally, how concern for the common good can help us. And I have time reserved for questions and comments and criticism, which is welcome, after each one of these sections. But meanwhile, if you if there's a point of clarification, like what did you mean by this, and you think it's better to clarify it at the time, then just raise your hand. That's fine. Okay. So going through some of this quickly because most of this is certainly not news. As I think most of you know, the work to develop a treaty and then implementation around ozone depletion was taken as the model, by and large, for crafting a climate change regime slightly later. And we tend to forget about ozone as kind of that thing in the past, but in fact, it was perceived correctly as an extremely imminent and fast-moving threat to life on Earth. And when the Montreal Protocol was signed in 1987, curtailing the use of the most destructive refrigerants and other, chlorofluorocarbons and some related, the effect, I don't know if you can see that dot's a little wimpy, but there's where it happens, 1987, and the emissions immediately fall. Quite dramatic. You will not be surprised, in fact, you're well familiar with the fact that if you look at the comparable trends for signing or beginning the negotiations, 1990, for the UN agreement on climate change, signed in 1992, things just keep going up. And so the contrast is, in 20 years, a 75% decrease in ozone depleting substances, and over 30 years, a 55% increase. While all those climate talks are going on, and while lots of important work, both technological and policy related, is going on, it's not like nothing is happening, it's just not enough, the trend goes the other way. Okay, so the climate establishment, as I said, to simplify, let's just talk about the UN system because that's kind of the focus of it all. They have been now meeting this will be the 30th Council of the Parties coming up in Brazil this fall. And looking at how to characterize it, I can't do better than Pope Francis's encyclical from 2015, Laudato Si. And he says regarding the international climate agreements, "It is remarkable how weak international political responses have been. The failure of global summits on the environment make it plain that our politics are subject to technology and finance. There are too many special interests, and economic interests easily end up trumping the common good and manipulating information so that their own plans will not be affected. Consequently, The most one can expect is superficial rhetoric, sporadic acts of philanthropy, and perfunctory expressions of concern for the environment, whereas any genuine attempts by groups within society to introduce change is viewed as a nuisance based on romantic illusions or an obstacle to be circumvented. I think that's spot on, unfortunately. So, one of the principles that has guided work at the international level is sometimes referred to as liberal environmentalism. By liberal, I don't mean FDR's New Deal. I mean liberal in its classic British 19th century sense of free markets are critical, and without free markets, you will not have free people, and the individual is the kind of the core point of reference. And that was stated at the Rio Summit, sometimes called the Earth Summit, which gave us the Biodiversity Treaty and was the launching point for the UN Climate Convention, states explicitly that growth is critical and an open international economic system, which sounds fine when put that way, was essential. But the part of the background here is that quite a lot of back and forth in the preceding decade, this is 1992, between developing countries in the South and developed countries in the North was a push on the one hand by the global South to get much more international attention and assistance on environmental issues, biodiversity, climate change, pollution, and so forth. But the price that the global North extracted brought together in the Rio agreements and followed thereafter was what's sometimes called neoliberalism, a situation in which markets, corporations have to be given the maximal freedom to operate on the theory that the growth that will engender will aid development. Now, that's not totally wrong, but when carried out as it has been, the result has been very damaging, I think. Okay, not going to go into much more on that, but I would say my interpretation is that the real focus of the powerful states engaged in the global climate negotiations really, the focus is really about protecting existing flows of capital and existing concentrations of power. And you know the last two councils of the annual meetings, the COPs, have been held in petro-states, for heaven's sakes, Azerbaijan and the UAE. I mean, it kind of says it all. All right, I need to move on here and spend less time. I will make these points just quickly. First of all, the international... Okay, so first of all, the international regime really ignores what is generally called carbon lock-in, the myriad ways in which we are stuck at the fossil fuel teat, essentially, and that make it extremely difficult to break out, whether it's reducing the use of plastics, reducing the dependence on gasoline and diesel fuels, and so on. And this has multiple aspects. It's technological, it's institutional, as when Wyoming or Alaska as a state is dependent upon the taxes generated by fossil fuel industries. So understandably, they're not eager to shift out of that. There is a financial lock-in. I won't really go into that, but again, it's part of a neoliberal order. And then there is probably most fundamentally the way in which consumption at a high level, and particularly consumption of fossil fuels, is built into our understanding of how we live. One example would be that over the past 40 to 50 years, both in North America and in Europe, you see that home sizes, single-family homes, get larger and larger and larger, and the number of people in those homes gets smaller and smaller and smaller, thus doubly inefficient, doubly and wasteful from an energy standpoint. Okay. That's an unnecessary, though lovely slide. Couple points quickly. Well, okay. First, I'd like you to compare Alfred E. Newman, who is responsible for enforcing really the climate side of these international agreements, and the Dementors, who are responsible for enforcing the corporate side of these agreements. So my example was by 2021, and this was really hyped at the COP26 information, the delegates had agreed, this is after 30 years, they had agreed to a non-binding and more or less meaningless resolution that we should start edging away from using coal by the 2040s or as early thereafter as feasible. Okay, so it means nothing, and even so, the United States, Russia, and China, three of the largest consumers of coal in the world, refused to sign it. Okay, so this is basically pointless. On the other hand, on the profit side, we have numerous investor-state agreements between countries that are the recipients of direct investment from corporations, and those corporations, that limit the country's legal ability to cut back on fossil fuel emitting projects, or they face immense fines. Now, this has become an issue that's increasingly recognized, I'd say, in the last 5 years in particular, and there is a push for countries, European countries, and maybe even the United States to move away from those agreements. But this is run by various international private groups, and the fines can be crippling. Okay. The logic of carbon offsets, you know about carbon offsets. If you want to fly from Medford to Chicago and you want to feel good about yourself, or I don't mean that sarcastically, you can pay extra so that some tree will be planted somewhere. Now that, unfortunately, is generally the concept of offsets within one airshed, for example, where it really can be enforced, can be extremely useful. But the idea of offsets of German steelmaking emissions by some trees that somebody is supposed to plant in the Amazonian rainforest, this is generally somewhere between highly uncertain and outright fraud. But there's a great quote, there's a group that formed itself just to parody this, called Cheat Neutral. When you cheat on your partner, you add to the heartbreak, pain, and jealousy in the atmosphere. Cheat Neutral offsets your cheating by funding someone else to be faithful and not cheat. This neutralizes the pain and unhappy emotion and leaves you with a clear conscience. This is exactly the logic behind the international carbon emissions offset program. And the fundamental point is why should we allow a profitable manufacturer in a rich country to escape responsibility for reducing carbon emissions and instead dissolve any place specificity and just create this abstract carbon credit, which is totally in line with the climate economics as it's practiced and with the idea of a neoliberal order. And then it's fine. Somewhere else, something will happen. or not. Okay, the last point is just to say that for those of you who are aware, we hear the phrase net zero emissions. President Biden pledged to get us to net zero emissions by 2050. This just means, obviously, that the sources and the sinks are going to balance out. And if we can't reduce the emissions from the sources enough, we're going to find new ways of sucking up and in one sense, that goes on all the time. Forests are a sink for carbon while they are living. The sea is a sink for carbon, but it's getting full, et cetera. But what goes under the heading of negative emissions is really largely a fantasy, which has been a gradually acknowledged fact in economics by some for several years. The current preferred approach is giant vacuum cleaners, essentially, which will require themselves vast amounts of energy all around the world to suck carbon out, etc. And here's a statement from 2021 by three eminent climate scientists. Robert Watson was the chair of the International Panel on Climate Change. And he says, instead of confronting our doubts, we built these models in which this all works. The negative emissions make things balance. The price to pay for our cowardice, having to keep our mouths shut about the ever-growing absurdity of the required planetary scale carbon dioxide removal. Okay. All right, well, as usual, I went on too long on that, but comments, questions? Yes, what joy, what's the point? What is the point?
I understood the first slide because I went to the Pacific program, and so I understood the first slide. But I still don't. Are you going to say more about how to get to the social values?
Yes.
Okay.
Why me?
Hopefully, I will not linger so much. Other comments? Yes, sir, in the blue.
One of the latest comments from President Trump is that greenhouse gas emissions aren't polluting.
Right, and Lee Zeldin's EPA is working to remove as you know, to cancel the finding, dating back a decade or more, that greenhouse gases are pollutants, under which the Supreme Court said, well, okay, then it falls under the Clean Air Act. I think that was a comment, not a question, right?
That was a comment.
Yeah. Yeah. I guess the point of my comments are that even if Donald Trump were replaced by the Earth Mother, we would still have lots and lots of problems. But, okay. Yes.
My question, I don't know if you can answer, but when you consider that fossil fuel companies have known that there was going to be a problem since around the 1870s with some of the earlier studies that came out, and those results have been repeated and demonstrated over and over, is it a death wish? I mean, why are we doing this?
So that's a philosophical question that I'm unequipped to answer. I think it's a very profound one, and I ask myself that frequently. Let's move on. I don't know. Yes.
I feel like you've answered kind of my conundrum about why there isn't more noise about climate change as the most important issue. There are many important issues that we are protesting and getting on the streets for, but I haven't seen a lot of real organized national protests that just focus on climate change, and I think you just clarified that for me.
Okay. If I can clarify anything, I think that's a win. Thank you. Maybe we should move on. There'll be more opportunities for. Okay. All right, how climate science divides us. This is really what I should have been spending my time on, but it's also interesting. So, number one, I would argue, and I hardly think I'm alone here, we've defined the problem, or we've framed the problem incorrectly. To keep it short, just say we framed the problem of climate change as though it was a classic pollution problem, which worked for the ozone challenge. It worked for cleaning up Love Canal, et cetera. But it doesn't work here. And let me elaborate a little bit. So if climate change is an environmental problem, then we want to focus on emissions. Just as if Love Canal is polluted by toxins, you want to remove those toxins. Now, we do want to reduce emissions dramatically. I'm not, this is not some contrarian position here. The question is how what we focus on as a matter of policy, action, and messaging. So I'm suggesting that the focus on 427.7 parts per million is the current status, as the Guardian published a few days ago, it's alarming. I know I should be scared, but it doesn't do much else. Okay, if we focus on emissions, so why else? Why is this so bad? Well, it's good in that it is totally consonant with the climate science. Greenhouse gas emissions is the overwhelming, not the only, but the overwhelming driver of human-caused climate change. But when we do this, we make the costs very culturally salient. They become very clear. And the benefits, not so much. The costs are short-term. We can recognize in the short term local discernible. For example, as we pursue winding down the oil and gas industry, then these guys who work in an oil rig in a difficult, highly skilled, and well-paid trade are going to lose their jobs. They know it. I mean, that's part of the logic. Now, yes, some of that dislocation has to happen, but we are not putting anything out there tangible to say, well, this is why it's worth it. And so it is not as, I mean, it's crazy to say, as Trump did, that climate change is a hoax perpetrated by the Chinese government, which they have denied, but it is consonant with the logic that we ourselves, that the climate action, the world of climate research and policy has set up. We're kind of inviting that response. Okay. Just so we're polarized over climate change, and you knew that. So this is in response to international polling. Is climate change a major threat, minor threat, not a threat? Don't know. So you see, first of all, in the left-hand column A, that far fewer, 54% when this poll was done, agree that it's a major threat than in South Korea, for example. But what is really so different, what is more interesting, is that the gray columns show opinion by left-leaning, center, right-leaning respondents. And Korea and France and even Poland, there's not that much difference. Right and left-wing people more or less largely agree. You get to the United States and the wedge is 63%. And so really the rest of my comments are, how do we address that wedge of 63%? What can we do about it? And that's where I want to argue that one of the problems is that we have put science at the center of policy and messaging. Okay, so I've already made these comments. these are not, you can't really observe these. You can't, I mean, they're real in the sense that I believe they're real because I trust the chain of science, but it's not like acid rain in the 19th and 20th centuries, for example. And people who do climate research, who do climate policy, who do climate activism are also human beings, and under the drumbeat of incessant falsehoods, some highly organized and some just for the hell of it, denying any reality of the climate change, guess what? There is some defensiveness. And what that has led to is dismissing, I would say, dismissing disagreements as disinformation. I'm not talking about the ExxonMobil funded efforts, but people who are confused, who are not certain, who have different views, dismissing disagreements as disinformation, reducing climate change to a discussion to contending beliefs. You believe climate change? Okay, come on. You don't believe in climate change, you better stay out. You don't belong in this room. Not that we would say that, or even necessarily think that, but that is how a lot of the debate operates. And finally, the result is diminishing opportunities for collective action. Now, you may well say, well, who wants collective action? But let me give you a couple examples first of this science focus. When the Joan of Arc of the climate movement, Greta T., spoke to Congress testified in 2019, she said, I don't have a talk for you. I'm just handing you this IPCC report. What I want you to do is unite behind the science. Now, I'm sorry, I have great admiration for her, but that's a meaningless request. The science does not neatly translate itself into policy. And a more, to my mind, egregious example, the climate scientist John Cook has a book called Cranky Uncle versus Climate Change, which is not only problematic for the reasons I've already said, but is also totally ageist, in which he sets up the virtuous climate scientist trying to save the world, for heaven's sakes, against the old, stubborn, stupid, ignorant, stereotyped, crazy uncle who is suffering from a disease, science denial. And books like his can serve to inoculate. Okay, when we get to this point where people who disagree with us are diseased, we really have lost any possibility of communication. And I would say what you have here is not science, but scientism, which my dictionary defines as an exaggerated trust in the efficacy of the methods of natural science. We saw some of that, no matter where our views may differ on just what public health measures were appropriate during COVID, but I would say COVID did expose some problems with certainly skepticism about science, but maybe also some problems about how federal science was translated into policy. But in any case, that's my contention. You'll have a chance in a minute to speak up. So if you believe in climate change, of course, because I'm not an idiot. But on the other hand, people believe a lot of different things. This is a group of skeptics in front of the Australian Parliament in 2015. And to quote the Conservative Prime Minister of days gone by, Harold Macmillan, we have not overthrown the divine right of kings to fall down before the divine right of experts. And we should not ask people to fall down before the divine right of experts. We should ask them to listen and discuss. Okay. So here's another bit of data, different poll that segments American views, the so-called Six Americas study done by Yale and George Mason universities. From alarmed, the sky is falling, to dismissive, don't give me that BS, et cetera. Okay. And there has been some shift over time to the left toward more people agreeing that they're alarmed or concerned and so on. Okay. But from our logic, the way we set this up, Mr. Alarmed and Mr. Dismissive would have nothing, or Ms., let's not be sexist, Ms. would have nothing to say to each other. But in fact, these studies also show that they agree. Both ends, both extremes, they agree that personal and societal action to reduce energy use is really important. What have we done? We're talking about actions. We're talking about goals, increased energy efficiency. We have stepped out of what unfortunately has become an extremely politicized framework of climate change belief or theory or facts, and into something like we could work on this. Okay. So summing up this second part, I want to counterpose I've set up this nice contrast here. What I think has dominated our work from the international level, at least, and the way in which climate science translates the findings, is the environmental paradigm. I've already said that, where the problem is human interference in natural systems, and so you just kind of back that out. You get rid of the pollution, get rid of the human activity, and the problem, that's the answer. Natural sciences offer the answers, and these are really technical solutions, and you have to leave it to the experts because it's very complicated. Well, it is very complicated. I mean, the atmospheric chemistry involved in climate change and ozone, et cetera, is very complicated. But so the analogy with toxics in Love Canal. I would counterpose to that a different approach in which we say climate change is a social problem. It exists as part of a coupled, not just in nature out there, but we are part of a coupled human natural system, and we can't disentangle ourselves. And so climate change is it's an expression of how we have organized our world. Now you may say, well, I didn't do that, maybe not, but collectively we have a way of organizing the global economy, et cetera. We need many disciplines, and the solutions do not require technical answers as such. It requires citizen engagement, innovation, and mobilization in dialogue with the relevant types of expertise. And then we need to emphasize goals which increase human flourishing, such as climate justice. It's not like, none of this is being done. The shift from many of the activist groups, like I would say Extinction Rebellion is a useful example, which is focused very much on we need to get the scientific truth out there. Governments need to tell the truth. They need to put the science out there. The shift from that to many organizations, including those in the Rogue Valley, who have emphasized climate justice, I don't think that's the universal solution. That is not maybe appealing to everybody, but it is appealing in a way that we can understand humanly. And we can empathize, and we can say, that's worth my engagement. Okay. So, comments, questions, disagreement?
The library will be closing in 5 minutes. Please check out your materials at this time.
Right now.
And head towards the exit. I repeat, the library will be closing in 5 minutes.
Climate justice be considered something like DEI?
Well, the question was, wouldn't climate justice be considered something like DEI? Well, I would say that it could well be in the target of the federal government next week, sure. So you're full of just joy this evening. I guess that's the climate science is certainly in the crosshairs. As you know, the 6th national climate assessment, which by statute has to be produced and due in 2028, has basically been put on hold. All the authors fired, the support contract canceled. Other comments? Yes, sir.
Go back.
Well, Kathy's going back there. We'll give a minute. Yes, sir.
What's that? Okay. Going back to your previous slide, I guess I can understand the right side as a former scientist should work based on the Montreal Protocol, but we've tried it for a while and it's not. I get that. And I guess the problem is we're dealing with humans. And so I can certainly appreciate the left side now in terms of trying a different tact to get at this problem. And one of my questions was in the slide where you showed the delta between countries. Is there some social properties of these other countries that led to a smaller delta between the left and right?
So that was actually, I'd like to comment on your first point, and perhaps somebody else might care to pick up on the divergence left-right by country. Both ozone, and you said, well, I get now, or sure, I understand why climate change has been so difficult to deal with because it's caused by humans. Right. Ozone depletion is also caused by humans. But so the critical difference really, I would say, and I don't think this is a deep insight here, is that ozone depleting chemicals were economically not all that big in terms of its value. There was a specialized niche made by, I think, something on the order of 16 companies worldwide. And substitutes have gradually been found that are less damaging. And with some threats and cajoling, DuPont and then others went along. While, as you well know, the fossil fuel, not just fuel, but the role of carbon-based materials, as feedstocks, as fuels, and so on, is built into pretty much every aspect of our economies around the globe.
Yeah, I wasn't saying that it's caused by humans. I was saying it's because we're dealing with humans.
Right,
Because the fossil fuel is so integrated into our self-destruction.
right, right.
Over here.
It seems like another way of describing the social problem is just follow the money. Basically, money is the deal. The investment of corporations and what's profitable and all of that. And until we get a tipping point that says it's economically advantageous to help to mitigate the climate problem, I think we're doomed because it's my job, it's my economics, it's my products, it's our manufacturing, it's our this, it's that. It's so entrenched. And so to me, another way, you may describe it as a social problem. Well, greed is the social problem.
May I have your attention, please? It's now 7 p.m. and the library is now closed. The library will reopen tomorrow at 10 a.m. I repeat, the library is
Sir?
now closed.
Yeah, the thing about economics, I think, is important. And I guess Trump has just recently said that he doesn't want any more electric vehicles and such. And China's eating our lunch. And if we could focus on that, look what's going to happen over here. They're beating us. Let's get our economy geared up and beat China. That kind of a
Right.
focus would hopefully might be
I
helpful.
mean, the economics is complex because, as you know, and you just pointed out, in a number of areas, renewable energy sources are cheaper now than conventional fossil fuels. But as to the we're doomed, I hope not. But if the last part, and I wanted to try to do a time check because I'm really out of time in terms of another like 5 minutes. Can that work?
Yes, please.
Okay. I want to leave us not with we're doomed, but okay, well, we're doing some good things, and here are some strategies that might make it even better.
I didn't say we're doing that better.
No. I say that to myself at about 2 a.m, probably 2 or 3 nights a week, okay? I'm just trying to be up here. Oh, yes.
Yeah.
Louise.
Well, I think part of the problems of the difference of the percentage differences in the United States between right and left are political, of course, and also educational. I mean, we
can't hear you. Hold it close.
okay. We're kind of dumbed down in this country. Education has been dumbed down a lot, and certainly China is much more into education than we are. And also, we're so big and have a lot more resources than other countries. So all I know is that Europe is the fastest, has the fastest changing climate right now. That's what I've read in the world, and it's hitting them really hard in very specific ways, and it's hitting us too, but we're so big that, okay, the Southwest is burning, the forests here are burning, but it isn't, I don't think it's been acknowledged yet as big as it is. I also have another thing to say about naming things. We started off by calling it global warming. Now we're calling it climate change. We need to call it climate catastrophe, and that needs to be the word that we use.
Okay, thank you. All right, I'd like to move. All right, one more comment.
I really agree with your left side. The left side of your this slide, and I recognize that the sciences are the way and the connection that needs to be grabbed. But I guess my comment is that finding a way to very aggressively work on the citizen engagement. And then how do you go, actually what I'm asking is to think in terms of how do you actually go about creating that engagement and developing that innovation. And that's something, obviously, that we haven't got even close to actually talking about how you do those things.
All right, so let me go through the last bit here, and then we can revisit your question if there's time. Okay. It's all very telling comments, obviously. Okay, how concern for the common good can help us. So I put this here. It is, as the caption says, this was created by elementary school students in England. And it, to me, just speaks to, obviously, the bad scenario on the right, the good scenario on the left. It speaks to a genuine emotional connection with, on the one hand, hope, on the other hand, fear. But the hope side, what they want to conserve, is that I'd like us to just kind of keep that sense in front of us as I make these two other examples. Okay. I want to briefly describe a town that has done the right things. It's farm town, okay? Of the future is visible long before you reach the city limits. Wind turbines pump electricity into the local grid, providing energy to make carbon neutral fertilizer. Closer in, cows graze next to solar panels that provide them with shade. A county-wide compost operation disposes of food and agricultural waste. Electric buses take kids to school. public library, blah, 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 and even the liquor store has solar panels. Okay, and then, so as the Wall Street Journal says in its teaser on this piece from last year, where is this? Well, this is a very conservative town of about 5,000 people in rural Minnesota that went for Trump by, I think, 22 points in 2020, and I would guess probably went by even a greater margin in 2024. So, what's going on here? This is cognitive dissonance. This does not fit our model. Okay. As the city manager said, we never made this about climate. We just did it because it made sense, and the more we did, the more we wanted to do. I can put some words into his mouth or their mouths. The values of thrift and self-reliance made this an attractive thing to do. Yes, it costs less. Yes, it's self-contained. Yes, it's not screwing up. It's not creating all this mess. There was a change agent at the University of Minnesota in Morris that was technically supporting this effort, but there was no effort to say, climate change, gotta fight climate change. No, let's not be stupid. Let's use the free energy that's all around us. Anyway, and a second example, so this illustrates the point I showed earlier about the two extremes. Yeah, we agree on this. We agree on those goals. Okay, a second example is from Scotland, just going through this quite quickly. So resource peripheries, as you probably know, are simply areas that have natural resources that function fundamentally to extract them and ship the wealth, the resources and the wealth elsewhere. The upper circle, oil and gas, that's the Shetland Islands, the North Sea fields for Britain, and wind power for what are called either the islands in general and of Scotland, Scottish Highlands. But here I'm talking about what's sometimes called the Outer Hebrides or the Western Isles. It's potentially another resource periphery serving the needs of the metropolitan area. Okay, but it didn't quite work that way, because such communities also can organize around symbolically resonant characteristics of their lives, their landscape, and so on, to either resist development or to catalyze innovative alternatives. And that's just what I want to talk about as my final example. So this is a picture of the Isle of Lewis. My wife and I were there a couple of years ago. It's really extremely beautiful. And in 2004, there was a proposal from two large corporations to create wind turbines on an industrial scale. 234 by 1 in one project design, 300 feet high, on an island that is only 12 miles across. So the red dots represent one project plan and the blue another. So basically most of the island would be covered in wind power, which would be shipped off island, obviously. It would have created 700 megawatts. This is 2004, it was proposed. That would have created 700 megawatts of power, which would have made it then the largest renewable project in Europe. The Scottish government had the decision on whether to approve it, and opposition, the opponents outnumbered the supporters 100 to 1, and the Scottish government canceled it. Okay, but meanwhile, one of the ongoing developments in Scottish politics, once they got Scottish Parliament back in 1999, it had been vacated by the British government as a punishment in 1707, so they had nothing between that. Now the Scottish Parliament has jurisdiction over things which are exclusively Scottish. It includes energy and so on. one of those other issues is land ownership. Scotland has and probably had and probably still has the most concentrated land ownership in Europe. But meanwhile, you have more than a century. I won't go into the history here of the land clearances in the 19th century, but they are fundamental to Scottish history, particularly Highland history. And the pushback starting in the last third of the 19th century legislatively to create rights for tenant farmers then led to legislation in 2003, which essentially required large landowners to sell their land to their tenants. And as one delegation visiting from China said, purportedly, we could never do that there in China. You know, it's pretty serious. It has worked mainly as a threat. But so for example, one of the areas that would have been involved in the 700 megawatt project is now a community trust with 22 villages and 2,000 people. And they built 3 turbines powering 2,100 homes. And guess what? By 2020, 70% of the Western Isles lived on community-owned estates. So that trajectory is intersecting the interest in sustainable renewables. Okay, and then now I'm just going to jump to the Scottish-wide. The Scots have been very busy. And what is called community and locally owned renewable energy, that can be a church, it can be a municipality, it can even be a local business if it's not a large corporation, community land trust, whatever. They have collectively created almost 28,000 renewable energy projects by 2023, creating over 1 gigawatt of power. That's 30% more than that massive project would have created. And the aim is part of the aim is to oppose a dependency culture in which the Scots are simply producing resources for others, but rather where they retain the earnings, they use the power, and it helps support efforts to keep a livelihood going in the Scottish Isles. And the graph simply shows over this period of time from 2010, the number of installations and the operating capacity. And in 2023, I had an opportunity to attend the annual meeting of Community Energy Scotland, which was fascinating. These are about 80 people, almost all of whom are working they're Scots, first of all. Most of them are in their 20s and 30s. They are working in Scottish communities, islands and mainland, on wind power, solar power, tidal power. I was extremely impressed by the level of organization, by the combination of technical knowledge and local political understanding. And the day-long session was educating one another and lots of technical presentations, many of which were totally over my head. This is simply one that actually I could understand what they were talking about. But it's an example of a very successful push at a local and regional level to build on culturally salient values. Our land, supporting one another rather than becoming yet again dependent on the economies offshore in Britain and Europe, that have achieved a great deal. So back to my conclusions, climate change is as much a social as a technical problem. I mean, it is a technical problem, and we need technological solutions. I'm not at all suggesting those aren't important. They're critical. They're just not everything. We need to look to the social as well as natural sciences for solutions. We need to mobilize around shared goals. We need to shape strategies for mitigation around social values and practices. And pursue climate action as a co-benefit of other socially desired goals. So thank you very much. I have used up too much time, but hand it over to Daniel.
Perfect. Thank you very much.